On a humid afternoon in October 1908, a crew of 43 men was cutting a drainage levee along the Black Warrior River in Hale County, Alabama. Their shovels struck what they thought was a buried log. It was not a log, it was a femur, 41 inches long. Within 6 hours of digging, they uncovered 78 more. Within 3 days, the count crossed 300. By the end of the second week, the foreman's logbook listed 904 skeletons stacked in a single continuous layer, 11 feet below the surface. Every adult specimen exceeded 7 feet in height. The largest measured 9 feet 4 inches. None of these remains exist in any museum today. This is the story of the cut that was never supposed to be made, and the layer that was never supposed to be found. Before we go deeper into the soil of Hale County, take a second to subscribe and ring the bell. This channel survives on viewers who refuse to let the buried record stay buried. Hit subscribe, and we can begin. To understand what happened in 1908, you have to understand what Moundville was before anyone put a shovel into it. The site sits on a bluff above the Black Warrior River, about 13 miles south of Tuscaloosa. By the time American settlers arrived in the early 1800s, the place was already a quiet field of grass-covered hills. There were 29 of these hills. Some rose only a few feet above the plain, others climbed nearly 60 feet into the air. The largest had a flat summit wide enough to hold a small village. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern around a central plaza, and the whole complex covered roughly 300 acres. The official story, then and now, is that these mounds were built by the ancestors of the Muskogean-speaking peoples, sometime between the year 1100 and the year 1450. The construction is credited to a culture archaeologists call Mississippian. The mounds, according to that story, were ceremonial platforms. Chiefs lived on top. Temples sat at the summit. The dead were buried inside. That story has problems. Local Creek and Choctaw elders interviewed by territorial surveyors in the 1820s consistently said the mounds were not built by their ancestors. They said the mounds were already old when their grandfathers arrived. They called the builders by names that translate roughly as the tall ones, the old ones, or the people who came before. None of these elders claimed the construction. The first formal excavation at Moundville was conducted by a Philadelphia gentleman named Clarence Bloomfield Moore between 1905 and 1906. Moore worked from his steamboat, the Gopher, which he had outfitted as a floating laboratory. He documented hundreds of burials, recovered ceremonial objects of carved stone and copper, and published his findings in a thick, illustrated volume the following year. Moore was thorough. He was also selective. He dug where he expected to find things, and he stopped when the soil stopped yielding what he was looking for. Moore never cut a deep trench. He never went below the standard burial depth of 4 to 6 feet. He had no reason to. The graves he was studying were all within that range. The men who cut the levee in 1908 went down 11 feet. They were not archaeologists. They were not looking for anything. They were trying to keep the river from flooding the cotton bottoms in the spring. The levee project was authorized by the Hale County Board of Commissioners in the spring of 1908. The contract went to a man named Jasper Whitlow, who owned a small earthworks company out of Marion. Whitlow hired 43 men, most of them tenant farmers from the surrounding plantations. The foreman was Henry Callaway, a former railroad surveyor from Demopolis, 51 years old, sober, and known in the county for keeping meticulous notebooks. The cut ran along the northern bend of the Black Warrior, about a half-mile downstream from the largest mound at the Moundville complex. It was not on the mound itself. The bone layer the crew uncovered was not inside a mound. It was beneath the floodplain, in undisturbed alluvial soil, 11 feet below the surface, and stretching for at least 470 feet along the cut line. Callaway's notebook, fragments of which were quoted in the Tuscaloosa News in late October 1908, recorded the first strike at 3:40 in the afternoon on October 9th. The shovel belonged to a man named Elias Burden. Burden thought he had hit a buried root. He cleared the dirt away with his hand. What he saw was the rounded end of a long bone, white from the surrounding clay, polished smooth by groundwater. He called Callaway over. Callaway measured the exposed length at 22 inches. They kept digging. By sundown, they had uncovered the rest of the femur and the matching one beside it. Both measured 41 inches from end to end. A modern adult human femur averages about 17.5 inches. The bones were not fossilized. They were not stone. They were calcified, yellowed, but still recognizably bone, with marrow channels intact and joint surfaces preserved. Calloway sent a rider to Tuscaloosa that evening with a written note for the county sheriff. The note asked, in plain language, what to do about a grave that did not belong to anyone the crew recognized. By the morning of the 10th, the question had multiplied. The crew had uncovered 4 more femurs, 2 complete pelvises, and the lower half of a spinal column. The pelvises were broad, the vertebrae were thick. The proportions were not those of a tall, thin person. They were the proportions of someone built heavy and large in every dimension. By the afternoon of the 11th, the count was 28 individuals. By the morning of the 15th, it was 142. The crew stopped counting individuals and started counting skulls. The skulls were the part that broke the men's composure. Burden, the labourer who had struck the first femur, walked off the job on the 4th day. He told a Tuscaloosa news reporter the following spring that he could not sleep after handling the first complete skull. The skull, he said, was the size of a soup kettle. The eye sockets were deep and slightly rectangular. The jaw was heavy. The teeth were worn flat but complete, with a double row of molars on the lower jaw, 6 on each side instead of the standard 3. Double rows of teeth would become the most consistent reported feature across the entire layer. Calloway recorded the trait in his notebook on 27 different individuals before he stopped noting it as unusual. 2 of the men in the crew, an older labourer named Saul Pickens and a young man named Caleb Ardrey, also confirmed the trait when later questioned by a county justice of the peace. The cranial capacity was the second feature. A normal adult human skull holds about 1,400 cubic centimetres of brain matter. Calloway, who had taken an anatomy course at a teacher's college, estimated by water displacement that the skulls in the layer held something closer to 2,200 cubic centimetres. He did not have the proper equipment to measure precisely. He filled the cranial cavity of one specimen with dry corn kernels and counted them. The number, recorded in his notebook on October 17th, was approximately 1.5 times the count he obtained from a normal skull provided by the county coroner for comparison. The third feature was the elongation. The skulls were not round. They were oval, stretched front to back, with a pronounced ridge running down the center of the cranium from the brow to the back of the head. This kind of elongation has been documented in other archaeological contexts, often attributed to artificial cradleboard binding in infancy. But the Moundville skulls did not show the telltale flattening of the rear of the head that comes with binding. The elongation appeared to be natural. The fourth feature, the one that the older labourers refused to discuss publicly, was the hands. Several of the skeletons were uncovered with their hand bones intact and articulated. The hands were not the hands of a tall human. They had 6 fingers. The 6th finger was not a vestigial nub. It was fully formed, with 3 phalanges and a normal joint articulation branching from the side of the little finger. The artifacts found with the skeletons did not match the Mississippian culture Moore had documented 4 years earlier. Moore's burials at Moundville had contained ceremonial pottery, stone pallets carved with geometric motifs, copper plates embossed with the falcon warrior figure, and shell beads strung as necklaces. The objects were consistent with what archaeologists across the southeastern United States had been finding in late Mississippian contexts for decades. The objects in the 1908 layer were different. Calloway's notebook lists 31 distinct objects recovered before the layer was sealed off. Most of these objects were copper. None were the thin, embossed plates Moore had catalogued. They were heavy. 3 were described as helmet fragments, with curved profiles and rivet holes along the lower edges. 2 were described as flat discs the size of dinner plates, polished on one side and engraved on the other with patterns of nested circles and radiating lines. 1 was described as a tube about 11 inches long, hollow, with a flared mouth, possibly a horn or a speaking instrument. There were also stone objects. A black stone tablet measuring 14 by 8 inches was recovered near the third skull from the eastern end of the cut. The tablet was carved on both sides with rows of incised marks. Callaway, who had seen Cherokee syllabary characters during his railroad work in northern Georgia, wrote in his notebook that the marks were not Cherokee, not English, not any letter form he had ever encountered. He copied a portion of the marks into his notebook on October 19th. That page of the notebook was the one most extensively photographed by the Tuscaloosa News before the notebook itself disappeared. There were 5 more tablets. 2 were sandstone, 3 were a dark grey slate. All 5 carried the same kind of marks. Callaway noted that the marks ran in horizontal rows and that certain symbols repeated at intervals, suggesting a writing system rather than decoration. There was a metal object that Callaway could not identify. It was a small disc, about 2 inches across, dull silver in colour, heavier than lead, with a small hole drilled through the centre. He noted that it did not tarnish in the open air the way silver would, and did not respond to a magnet. He also noted that when he held it close to a candle flame, the disc grew warm to the touch within seconds. He set the disc aside in a separate cloth pouch. The pouch, like the notebook, did not survive what came next. The Tuscaloosa News carried the first story on October 23rd. The headline read, "Strange Burial Ground Uncovered at River Cut near Moundville." The article was 4 columns wide. It quoted Callaway directly. It described the bone count, then standing at 370 individuals, and the unusual proportions of the remains. It mentioned the artifacts. It did not mention the 6 fingers or the double rows of teeth. The reporter, a young man named Lawton Fennell, was instructed by his editor to keep the article focused on the size of the bones and to leave the more sensational details out until further confirmation could be obtained. The story was picked up the following week by the Birmingham Age Herald, the Mobile Register, and the Memphis Commercial Appeal. Within 10 days, it had reached the New York Times, which ran a brief item on page 11 under the headline, "Alabama Levee Crew Finds Bones of Large Race." The Times item ran 3 paragraphs. It quoted no one by name. It described the discovery as awaiting confirmation by experts from Washington. The experts from Washington arrived on the morning of November 3rd. There were 4 of them. They came by train to Tuscaloosa and were driven to the cut by automobile, which was itself an event in Hale County in 1908. The senior member of the party introduced himself to Callaway as Dr. Wendell Hartshorne, representing the Bureau of American Ethnology. His credentials were a printed letter on Smithsonian Institution stationery, signed by an undersecretary, whose name Callaway recorded as Edgar Means. Hartshorne was polite. He was also direct. He told Callaway that the federal government was assuming custody of the remains and artifacts under a provision he described as the Antiquities Clause. He produced a second letter, this one from the office of the Alabama State Geologist, confirming the transfer of authority. Callaway, who had no legal training and no instructions from his employer, accepted the letters and stepped aside. For the next 11 days, Hartshorne and his 3 assistants worked the cut. They did not invite the local crew to assist. They brought their own labourers, 6 men hired from a Birmingham boarding house, none of whom spoke to the Tuscaloosa News, and none of whom returned to Hale County after the work ended. The team built a canvas enclosure over the active section of the cut. They photographed extensively. They crated the remains and the artifacts in wooden boxes marked with stenciled inventory numbers. They sealed each box with lead-pressed wire. By the morning of November 15th, there were 117 crates stacked at the railroad siding in Moundville Junction. By the evening of November 16th, the crates were gone. The crates travelled north under the manifest of a private freight contract. The destination listed on the shipping documents, according to a Tuscaloosa News inquiry the following spring, was the Smithsonian Receiving Warehouse at the Anacostia Rail Yard in Washington. The receiving warehouse had no record of the crates arriving. This was not unusual. The Smithsonian, by 1908, had a documented pattern of receiving large shipments of archaeological material and routing them to storage facilities that were not part of the public catalogue. A Senate inquiry in 1912 would later list 17 separate shipments from southeastern mound sites for which the institution had no public accession records. The Moundville shipment was not on the 1912 list, because the 1912 list was assembled from the institution's own internal records, and the Moundville shipment had been logged under a project code that was not cross-referenced to any standing collection. Callaway tried, over the course of the next 4 years, to find out where the bones had gone. He wrote letters to the Bureau of American Ethnology, to the Smithsonian's Anthropology Department, to Senator John Tyler Morgan of Alabama, and to a Philadelphia museum director who had corresponded briefly with Clarence Moore. The responses he received were uniform in tone. They thanked him for his interest. They acknowledged the importance of the find. They explained that the material was still under study, that no preliminary report had been authorized for release, and that further inquiries should be directed to the office of the Undersecretary, Edgar Means. Edgar Means did not respond to any of Callaway's letters. The notebook, which Callaway had kept in a locked drawer at his home in Demopolis, disappeared in the summer of 1913. He came home from a survey job in Wilcox County to find the drawer unlocked, the notebook gone, and 3 of his other field journals scattered on the floor. Nothing else in the house had been disturbed. He filed a report with the Demopolis police. The police took the report and filed it. No suspect was ever named. Callaway died of pneumonia in February 1917. His widow, Cordelia Callaway, gave an interview to a Birmingham reporter in 1922 inches, which she stated that her husband had spent the last 4 years of his life trying to reconstruct the contents of the lost notebook from memory. She had the reconstructed pages, she said, in a tin box in her attic. The tin box was opened by a great-nephew in 1958. The pages inside had been damaged by water and could no longer be read. The great-nephew, a man named Vernon Callaway, donated what remained to the University of Alabama Library. The donation was logged. The pages were placed in a manuscript collection labeled Callaway H. Personal Papers. The collection was reviewed for cataloguing in 1973. At that point, the file was empty. The Moundville find was not unique. It was part of a pattern that ran the length and breadth of the eastern United States from the 1830s through the early decades of the 20th century. In 1833, soldiers digging a powder magazine on Lompoc Rancho in California uncovered a 12-foot skeleton surrounded by polished stones, axes, and shells carved with strange symbols. The remains were reburied at the order of a local priest after indigenous workers refused to continue the excavation. In 1872, a farmer named Aaron Wright in Conneaut, Ohio, plowed up a burial mound on his property and uncovered the skeletons of 3 individuals, all over 8 feet tall, all with the same double-row dental anomaly that would later appear at Moundville. The remains were sent to the Geauga County Historical Society and were displayed for a brief period before being shipped, in 1879, to a destination listed only as the Federal Repository. In 1879, in Brewersville, Indiana, a mound excavation produced the bones of an individual approximately 9 feet 10 inches tall. The bones were placed in the basement of a local landowner. The basement flooded in 1937 and the bones were destroyed. In 1883, in Asterlan, Wisconsin, an excavation conducted by the State Historical Society produced fragments of a skeleton with a femur measuring 38 inches. The fragments were transferred to the Smithsonian and are no longer accessible. In 1885, in Gasterville, Pennsylvania, miners breaking through a sealed chamber inside a small mound found a single skeleton over 7 feet tall, surrounded by carved tablets bearing characters that were photographed before the find, was confiscated by what the local newspaper described as agents of the National Museum. In 1891, in West Virginia, an investigator named Norris Cabell, working under contract for the Bureau of American Ethnology itself, uncovered a skeleton in the Creel Mound near South Charleston that he recorded as measuring 7 feet 6 inches in length, with a jaw heavy enough that the lower mandible alone weighed nearly 2 pounds. The report was filed. The skeleton was crated. Neither has been seen since. The pattern is consistent. The remains are uncovered. The local press is notified. Photographs are taken. The federal authority arrives. The material is crated. The crates leave. The records are reclassified, lost, destroyed, or never created at all. The witnesses age and die. The story persists only in the local newspapers, in private letters, and in the memories of the families whose grandfathers held the bones in their hands before they were taken away. The Moundville layer raises a question that the official record has never answered. If the skeletons were the remains of a known population, why were they buried 11 feet below the floodplain in a layer 470 feet long, with no associated mound structure, no domestic debris, and no settlement pattern around them? The depth itself is the first clue. 11 feet of alluvial deposit on the Black Warrior floodplain represents, by the standard sedimentation rates calculated for that river system in the early 20th century, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 years of accumulation. This places the layer well before the Mississippian period to which the surface mounds are attributed. The bones were already in the ground for a millennium when the mound builders arrived. The continuous layer is the second clue. 904 individuals, deposited in a single horizon, in a single linear arrangement, does not match any known burial practice in the southeastern United States. Mound burials are vertical and clustered. Floodplain burials are individual and scattered. A continuous horizontal layer of this scale suggests a single event, a flood, a massacre, a migration that ended badly. Something that put 900 large-bodied individuals into the ground at the same time, in the same place, before the river had even begun to lay the sediment that would eventually cover them. The artifacts are the third clue. The copper helmet fragments, the engraved tablets, the unidentified metal disc, none of these match the material culture of any documented indigenous population in the region. The tablets in particular, with their rows of repeating symbols, point toward a literate culture. The accepted history of the southeastern United States contains no literate culture before European contact. Cherokee syllabary, the only indigenous writing system in the region, was invented by Sequoyah in the 1820s. Anything older is not supposed to exist. The Moundville layer is older. The Moundville layer contains writing. This is the part of the story that does not appear in any history textbook used in any school in the state of Alabama. It does not appear in the official interpretive materials at the Moundville Archaeological Park, which is now operated by the University of Alabama. It does not appear in the published archaeology of the Mississippian period. It exists only in the fragments of the Tuscaloosa News from October and November 1908, in the recollections of 3 witnesses who gave interviews to a Birmingham folklorist in the 1930s, and in a single photographic plate that survived in the personal collection of Lawton Fennell, the young reporter who broke the original story. Fennell kept the plate in a tobacco tin for the rest of his life. He showed it to his son, Carlin Fennell, in 1947, 2 years before he died. The plate was a glass negative, 4 by 5 inches, taken on the morning of October 25th, 1908, from the western end of the cut, looking east. It showed a section of the bone layer approximately 30 feet long, partially exposed. The skeletons were arranged side by side, their feet pointing south, their skulls oriented north. The image was sharp enough that the rectangular eye sockets and the heavy jaws were clearly visible on the 3 skulls nearest the camera. Carlin Fennell donated the plate to a small county museum in Greene County in 1981. The museum closed in 1994. The contents were transferred to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. The plate was logged into the photographic collection under the accession number 94-0817. The accession number is still active in the department's online finding aid. The plate itself, when requested by a researcher in 2019, was reported as missing from its archival sleeve. The department conducted an internal search. The plate has not been recovered. The 3 witnesses interviewed by the Birmingham folklorist in the 1930s were Saul Pickens, Caleb Ardrey, and a 3rd labourer named Roman Quincy, who had been 23 at the time of the dig. The folklorist, a woman named Estelle Vance, was collecting oral histories from working-class Alabamians for a project funded by the Federal Writers Project. Her interview notes, which survived in the Library of Congress collection of WPA materials, contained transcriptions of all three accounts. Pickens described handling a femur so heavy he could barely lift it with both hands. He described the smell of the layer, which he said was not the smell of decay but a sharp mineral smell, like wet copper, that came up and stayed in his clothes for a week. He described the way the federal team had photographed each skeleton from above before crating it, and the way the photographs were sealed into a separate metal case that travelled with Hartshorne personally. Ardrey described the tablets. He had handled 2 of them. He said the marks on the tablets were not decorative. He said the marks looked like sentences. He said he could tell where one sentence ended and another began, even though he could not read the symbols themselves. He said that one of the tablets had been broken in half before they uncovered it, and the break had been a deliberate cut, as though someone had taken a chisel to it long before it was buried. Quincy described the disc. He had not handled it himself, but he had been standing next to Calloway when Calloway held it near the candle flame. He described the way the disc grew warm. He described the way Calloway dropped it into the cloth pouch, as though afraid of it. He described the way Calloway looked at him afterward and said, in a quiet voice, that whatever this thing was, it was still working. Whatever was working in that disc, in those tablets, in those bones, in that layer 11 feet below the cotton bottoms of Hale County, has been working in silence for 117 years. The cut has long since been filled in. The river has shifted course twice. The crates are gone. The notebook is gone. The reconstructed pages are gone. The photographic plate is gone. The witnesses are gone. The men who came from Washington are gone, and whatever institution received the crates has, in every official statement issued for over a century, declined to confirm that any such material was ever in its possession. What remains is the pattern of the find, the pattern of the response, the pattern of the disappearance. A layer of 900 large-bodied individuals, with double rows of teeth and 6-fingered hands, buried in a writing-bearing culture beneath a southern floodplain, is not the kind of evidence that ordinary forgetting can account for. It is the kind of evidence that requires an active and continuous effort to keep buried. That effort has been remarkably successful. It has not, however, been complete. Henry Calloway's notebook is gone, the crates are gone, the plate is gone, but the Tuscaloosa News issues from October and November 1908 still exist on microfilm in the basement of the Hoole Special Collections Library in Tuscaloosa. The Estelle Vance interview transcripts still exist in the WPA Folklore Collection at the Library of Congress. The Senate inquiry list of unaccounted shipments from 1912 still exists in the National Archives. The pieces are scattered, and the pieces are quiet, but the pieces are there. If you have followed this story to the end, you already know what to do. You know how to look. You know what to look for. The buried record only stays buried as long as no one is willing to dig. The crew that cut the levee in October 1908 was not willing. That is the only reason any of this is known at all.